Most people believe they fall in love by choice, but rarely ask who or what is doing the choosing. Beneath the flutter of attraction, beneath the shared smiles and late-night conversations, something ancient and unseen is moving. It's not just chemistry, it's not just timing, it's a reflection, a mirror held up by the unconscious, showing us the parts of ourselves we've forgotten, denied, or never dared to meet. We say we are drawn to someone as if by a magnet, but what if that pull comes from deeper within, from the shadow that longs to be seen? We grow up believing in soulmates, the one person who completes us, finds us, saves us. But what if the truth is more dangerous, more honest? Carl Jung, the Swiss depth psychologist whose ideas reshaped modern thought, didn't believe in soulmates as fairy tales. He believed in them as psychological confrontations. In his world, a soulmate is not your perfect match. They are your perfect trigger. Not someone who makes you whole, but someone who shows you where you are not. In this long-form exploration, Carl Jung's perspective on soulmates and true love, we enter the realm of depth psychology, where the idea of the one is less about fate and more about self-discovery. This isn't about romance as you've been taught. It's about the shadow work psychology that underpins every intimate connection. It's about why we do what we do, and how the unconscious mind explains the strange magnetic forces that draw us towards certain people and repel us from others. This journey doesn't take place in a city or a forest, but in the shadowed corridors of the psyche, through the narrow passageways of memory, ego, and projection. We'll walk with Jung through the symbolic terrain of the Anima and Animus, the feminine and masculine forces within every soul. We'll confront the illusions of romantic fate, the myths of perfect compatibility, and ask, what is true love really when filtered through the lens of the unconscious? And if this kind of journey, psychological, emotional, reflective, resonates with you, then follow it. Let this be more than just another video. Subscribe, stay close, and keep walking with us into the terrain where love is no longer a mystery, but a mirror. Because once you start to see the patterns beneath desire, you begin to change them. And once you understand your own unconscious, you begin to choose love. Not blindly, but consciously. We didn't always believe in soulmates, not like we do now. Long before dating apps and candlelit vows, the idea of romantic love as spiritual destiny didn't exist. The ancient Greeks spoke of love in fragments: eros for passion, agape, divine love, philia for friendship. But it was Plato who first cracked open the metaphor we still carry today, that we are split halves of a single soul, wandering the earth in search of our missing piece. It's beautiful, poetic, tragic, and it laid the foundation for one of the most enduring myths in modern love. The myth that somewhere out there is someone made for you, and only you. But myth has a funny way of turning into expectation. Somewhere along the centuries, this story transformed from allegory to doctrine. Through medieval romanticism, Victorian idealism, and the modern fairy tale industrial complex, we absorbed it into our culture like gospel. To be single was to be incomplete. To find love was to be whole. Yet Jung would argue that this very belief blinds us to something essential, that wholeness does not arrive in the arms of another, but through the difficult inner work of self-integration. Carl Jung introduced the world to the idea of the shadow, the dark twin of our conscious personality, made of everything we hide, reject, or forget about ourselves. It lurks beneath our polite behavior and ideal self-image. And when we fall in love, it doesn't disappear. It dances, it seduces, it projects. Jung warned that the romantic other is often a projection screen for our unconscious material. The more we idolize them, the less we see them, and the more we reveal ourselves. The soulmate, then, is not a destined companion, but a psychological magnet, attracting us through need, pain, and potential. In this view, the soulmate is not here to complete us. They are here to reveal us, Not the person who fits us like a puzzle piece, but the person who activates our unconscious story. That story is shaped by early wounds, emotional blueprints, and unexamined beliefs, the hidden architecture of our longing. When we say someone feels like home, we may be speaking to this pattern, but not all homes are safe. Not all familiarity is healing. This is the terrain where self-awareness and transformation begin. The moment we stop asking who is right for us and start asking what parts of ourselves are crying out to be seen. Cultural norms often romanticize fusion. Two become one. You complete me happily ever after. But Jung's model of individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming whole within oneself, requires a radical shift in how we understand connection. It asks, what if true love doesn't dissolve boundaries, but respects them? What if the point of love is not to find the person who fills your gaps, but the one who holds space while you fill them yourself? To explore love through Jung's lens is to dismantle the idea that someone else can save us from ourselves. It's to walk backward through our desires and ask, where did this come from? What part of my inner world is shaping what I seek? And what happens if I meet that part, not with shame, but with curiosity? Carl Jung did not see love as a blissful merging of two people who simply fit. He saw it as a crucible, a container where the heat of intimacy forces our deepest material to the surface. To Jung, love wasn't merely an emotion or a passion. It was a force of transformation, and not always a gentle one. In our most intense relationships, we don't just fall in love, we fall into ourselves. What we call chemistry is often the recognition of something unspoken, unseen, and unresolved inside us. According to Jung, the figures we are drawn to romantically are rarely accidental. They are messengers of the unconscious, bearing symbols, projections, and archetypes that demand our attention. In this alchemical fire, true love becomes less about compatibility and more about what each person evokes in the other. Not just joy, but discomfort. Not just harmony, but challenge. It's not about being completed, it's about being confronted. This is where Jung's ideas of the anima and animus come in. Each of us, Jung believed, carries a psychological imprint of the opposite sex within our psyche. For men, it's the anima, a feminine inner presence shaped by their mother, by culture, by dreams. For women, the animus, a masculine inner figure built from father, authority, myth. These inner figures guide not only how we perceive the world, but how we are drawn to others. When we meet someone who seems irresistibly magnetic, we may be responding not to them as they are, but to what they symbolize, our inner opposite, the anima or animus made flesh. And this is why relationships, especially the passionate ones, can become so overwhelming. They trigger inner material that has been buried for decades. They awaken the childhood fantasies, the wounded expectations, the unconscious longings. We see the beloved through a veil, idealizing their presence, often ignoring the real person beneath the projection. This is the tragedy and the potential of love. It reveals who we are, even if we don't recognize ourselves in the process. Jung insisted that the real work of love begins when the projection dissolves, when the glow fades and we see the other person clearly, flawed, wounded, whole in their own way, and choose to stay, not out of illusion, but out of understanding. Because now, the relationship is no longer about fantasy. It is about emotional intelligence lessons, the capacity to relate with presence, humility, and awareness. The integration of the shadow becomes essential here. Every relationship will bring our shadow forward, the parts of us we would rather not face. Our envy, our neediness, our rage, our fear of abandonment, our urge to control. Love drags these out into the open, and not because it's cruel, but because it's honest. Because the unconscious is always seeking wholeness, and no journey toward wholeness can avoid the shadow. The beauty of this perspective is that it offers a kind of liberation. We are no longer victims of love's mystery. We are participants in its unfolding. We begin to realize that the challenges in our relationships are not signs of failure, but invitations. Invitations to go deeper, to understand ourselves, to engage in true mutual growth. This is the essence of what Jung meant by conscious relationship. One in which two people walk the path of individuation side by side, not merging but mirroring, supporting each other's unfolding. She paused, a strange look in her eyes, like she could sense someone watching. Her voice lowered. "If you've heard me, leave a trace before I forget who I was. And if her words find you, mark them with a comment, a share, a signal, before the silence returns." Before we can truly love another, Jung tells us, we must first encounter the stranger within, the inner other, the unclaimed aspects of our being that lie buried beneath performance, persona, and fear. Most of us fall into love looking outward, as scanning for signs, seeking that elusive right person to ignite meaning in our lives. But Jung's psychology demands we look inward. For the person we're seeking, the one who will love us as we are, must first be found within the contours of our own soul. This is the path of self-awareness and transformation, the difficult terrain of introspection that few willingly travel. It is uncomfortable to sit alone with yourself, to see the patterns of your past, the inherited beliefs, the wounds you've hidden under charm or achievement. But until these inner truths are faced, love will always be a reenactment, and the repetition of old dynamics in new faces. Jung warned us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And nowhere is this truer than in love. The search for a soulmate, then, is less about locating the one, and more about reclaiming the lost pieces of ourselves. As we grow in self-knowledge, we begin to notice the parts we once rejected. The tenderness we were told was weakness, the ambition we feared would make us unlovable, the darkness we buried to survive. We slowly begin to welcome them home. This process, Jung called individuation, the sacred task of becoming whole. And in doing so, our capacity for authentic connection deepens, because love in its highest form is not dependency. It is not escape. It is recognition. When two individuated people come together, they don't merge into one. They resonate, they reflect, they challenge and support each other's becoming. There is no need for possession, for control, for illusion. There is only presence, the rare sacred space in which one soul sees another, not as fantasy, but as truth. In the silence between shared glances, in the words left unsaid but deeply felt, this kind of love reveals itself. It doesn't burn with infatuation, it glows with depth. It holds the paradox of intimacy, that the more we know someone, the more mystery they contain. That true closeness is not about solving someone, but about being endlessly curious with them. This is the kind of love Jung pointed toward, not the love that completes you, but the love that accompanies you on your path to completion. And yet, this path requires a kind of death. The death of the romantic fantasy, the death of the illusion that someone else will save you from yourself. It's painful to let that story go, to realize that no one is coming to rescue you. But in that grief lies power. Because you begin to see that you were never missing anything. You begin to see that your soul was never broken, only buried. As the journey inward continues, what you seek in others begins to shift. You no longer crave intensity to feel alive. You seek stability to feel seen. You no longer chase mystery to escape boredom. You crave vulnerability to feel real. These shifts are signs that you are no longer loving from your wounds, but from your wholeness. That the unconscious is no longer dragging you toward familiar suffering, but toward conscious connection. And so the question changes. It is no longer who will love me, but who will walk beside me as I learn to love myself. It is no longer where is my soulmate, but how can I become the kind of soul who loves in truth, not projection. And in that transformation, we begin to taste the freedom that Jung described, the freedom to love not from hunger, but from abundance. There is a moment in every relationship, a moment that divides the myth from the truth, when the enchantment fades, the illusion dissolves, and all that's left is the raw presence of two human beings standing before each other with nothing but their histories, their hopes, and their shadows. It is in this moment that love either deepens or breaks. And according to Jung, what happens next isn't about fate. It's about choice. The modern idea of soulmates whispers to us about cosmic alignment, about destiny weaving threads through time, bringing two people together no matter what. But Jung was wary of this illusion. He believed that the more we surrender to the fantasy of predetermined love, the more we abandon our agency in the face of intimacy. Fate, in this view, becomes an excuse, a mask we wear to avoid the responsibility of being fully awake in our relationships. We say, it wasn't meant to be, when really we mean, I wasn't ready to choose. To love consciously is to love deliberately, to see not just who someone is, but what choosing them asks of you. Not what they promise to fulfill, but what you are willing to offer, to endure, to transform. Jung's psychology calls us to abandon passive yearning and step into active relationship. It asks us to move beyond attraction and into presence. Because while chemistry may bring two people together, it is conscious communication and mutual intention that determine whether they stay. This does not mean love becomes mechanical or cold. On the contrary, it becomes sacred when we are no longer blinded by projection or guided by unconscious patterns. We begin to see our partner, truly see them as they are, not as we need them to be. And from this place of clarity, we can choose again and again, not because we are bound by a story of soulmates, but because we are committed to the reality of shared growth. This is the quiet revolution of emotional maturity. To say, I choose you not because I believe you will complete me, but because I want to walk this unpredictable path with you as I learn to complete myself. It is a promise rooted not in fantasy, but in fierce presence, a kind of love that grows not from falling, but from rising, together separately over time. In Jung's vision, this kind of love is the reward of deep inner work. When we stop asking for someone to rescue us and start becoming the person who is capable of loving without illusion, something shifts. We no longer wait for destiny. We meet life as it is. We choose with intention, with responsibility, with soul. And choice, Jung would say, is one of the greatest powers of the awakened mind. It is what separates instinct from wisdom, compulsion from freedom. To choose your partner every day, not because you are enchanted, but because you are aware, is the beginning of a relationship that breathes, evolves, and survives the disillusionments that crush fairy tales. So the next time you find yourself wondering if someone is the one, pause. Listen not to the fantasy, but to the whisper of the unconscious beneath it. Ask, what is this person showing me about myself? What do I see in them that I have not yet faced in me? And then ask the real question, am I ready to choose them, not for who I want them to be, but for who they are? Because in Jung's world, why we do what we do in love is not just about desire. It's about depth, and only by choosing, with our eyes open, with our soul awake, can we experience the kind of love that does not fade when the story ends, but begins to live. We speak of soulmates as if they are rare, as if love, real love, is a singular flame flickering in the dark, waiting to be found once in a lifetime. But Jung's psychology tells a different story, a deeper story, one that does not limit, love to romance, nor confine its meaning to perfect timing and perfect fit. Love, in Jung's view, is not a destination. It is a field, an energetic space between people where meaning unfolds, where mirrors rise, where transformation begins. And in that field, we are constantly meeting soulmates in disguise. The mother who challenges your independence, the friend who stays through silence, the child who triggers your forgotten tenderness, the stranger whose words shake you awake. These are not accidents, they are invitations. The soul does not wait passively for the one. It is always reaching, always learning, always dancing with the archetypes around it. And when we open our eyes to this broader vision, we begin to see that true love can exist in many forms, each one offering a thread back to ourselves. In romantic love, we often look for completion. In other relationships, we look for understanding. But beneath all of them lies the same psychological task: to witness, to be witnessed, and to grow. Jung believed that every connection holds a symbolic message, a reflection of our inner terrain. When someone irritates us, awakens us, or captivates us, they are touching a part of our psyche that is asking to be seen. These interactions, painful, joyful, fleeting, enduring, are all part of what Jung would consider the individuation process. They are not detours from the path, they are the path. And so the idea of the one begins to dissolve. What replaces it is something more humbling and more powerful, the realization that we are all here to teach one another, to trigger one another's shadow, to call one another into wholeness. This is not a romantic fantasy. It is a spiritual responsibility. To love someone deeply, truly, is to accept the role of mirror, not to fix them, not to save them, but to reflect their truth back to them, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. This is where shadow work psychology becomes not just a therapeutic tool, but a way of life. Because as long as we keep projecting our unlived selves onto others, our unmet needs, our unclaimed power, our buried wounds, we remain stuck in cycles of disillusionment and blame. But when we bring that material back home, when we own it, integrate it, and learn from it, our relationships shift. Love becomes cleaner, softer, stronger. And in this expanded field of love, even loss becomes a teacher. Even heartbreak becomes holy, because every soul we meet, whether they stay or go, is part of the great unfolding of who we are becoming. They enter not to complete us, but to reflect what was missing, to awaken what was dormant, to prepare us for the next encounter with ourselves. This is the sacred rhythm of relational life, not fate, not fantasy, but conscious encounter after conscious encounter, each one bringing us closer to wholeness. So if you are still waiting for your soulmate, consider this. Perhaps you are already surrounded by them. Perhaps your soul is not waiting for the one, but for you to recognize the sacredness in all your relationships, the ones that broke you, the ones that built you, the ones that stayed. This recognition doesn't cheapen love, it liberates it. It says you don't have to wait, you don't have to be chosen, you don't have to be perfect, you only have to be present. And from that presence, something extraordinary happens. You begin to love not because you are desperate to be seen, but because you are willing to see. You begin to connect, not to escape yourself, but to return to yourself, again and again, through the eyes, hands, and hearts of others. Love in this light is no longer a myth. It is a practice, a mirror, a slow, sacred unfolding. You've reached the end, or perhaps just the first layer. Because what we uncover in the mind can't be neatly closed. If this story shifted something inside you, follow that instinct. Explore the next story in our psychology series, linked below, but tread carefully. The truths we find in others are often reflections of what we deny in ourselves.